Well,
What?
oh, recording.
Hey,
Uh, we're live.
yeah, the button's been pressed.
as,
All right.
as they say in the business, we're live. Where's
Okay.
the red light?
Okay.
It's blinking. Well, welcome everybody. Um, we're going to be interviewing or talking with and interacting with Kent Nerburn today, and you know, I think some of you are familiar with Kent, um, but let's get to know him a bit more. And I'm going to preface all of this. I should preface all of this with be thinking of questions, comments, how you're feeling, reactions, and things like that, because I'll remind you, this is an interactive format. The reason we do it on Zoom is we can take advantage of a kind of quasi parlor effect of being, or saloon effect of being able to have a central theme and a person who's invested in that central theme. And then the real magic happens when all of you interact with our guest or our subject. That's where the magic happens. That's where you get something out based on what you put in, so to speak. So, Kent, let's get started with talking about you and the book, because for this conversation, there may not be a big wide separation between the two for this conversation anyway.
Well, first of all, hello to everybody. I see one face. Other than that, I see names. But I look forward to talking to you. I'm talking to you from Oregon, where we moved from northern Minnesota after 25 years. And so we're now sort of in the cultural diaspora. Uh, but I'm a Midwesterner, and I'm I loved I love South Dakota. My book Neither Wolf Nor Dog was the South Dakota One book for 2019, I think, and it had a wonderful tour going all over the state, going to the various towns, and I mean that in a heartfelt way. I love South Dakota. I love North Dakota. I love the emptiness. I love the spaces. When we moved to northern Minnesota, I thought, oh, I'm going to be going up into the boundary waters and it's all going to be loons and canoes. But every chance I had to go somewhere, I got in my car and went into the prairies, went out and then would make it across into the plains. And it touched my soul. And so I'm happy to be back with you. And I'm back here in a way because of a very unusual book, quite out of keeping with what I normally did. Those of you that know me probably know me from my work in the bridge between native and non-native cultures, and that's where I spent 30 years of my life, working on the reservations in northern Minnesota, doing work with the Lakota and the Nez Perce in Idaho, and I it became kind of an accidental passion. I stumbled into one of those things that said, "This isn't what you are." This is almost a calling, because you've got some skills that work in this regard in being a translator. And I never have tried to be a native person. I don't. I think that's unseemly. I also think it's unseemly to try to traffic in native uh, themes for fun and profit, as we like to say. But one of the things that did happen, is people who don't deal with the native communities, but are good-hearted folks, usually look and say, oh, they've been treated so poorly. And they think that my task, or the task, is to learn the history and accept what it is and try to, in some way, make some recompense for what it was that happened, or at least in terms of understanding. And that's true. America has really tried to eradicate the native experience from its own historical narrative. But for me, the other side that matters most is when you get inside a culture, to the extent that I was able and am able, you start to learn the primary values that are not necessarily immediately apparent on the surface. And one of the things that the Native people have that meant a great deal to me uh, is a belief in the importance of the elder. And I remember being in a sweat lodge in Pine Ridge on my 60th birthday, which was 15 years ago now. And when we had to pray, I said, I want to know how it is I should be an elder because I'm coming to that time. And the elder's responsibility is, we tend in the non-native world to think in a linear sense. There's birth, there's a period of fecundity and productivity, and then you're on the glide path into insignificance. And put on your golf shoes and go to sleep. And no, but in the native world, it's a circle, and it's seasons, and only the person who's been in the last season, understands the previous seasons and can speak with authority, maybe not about the specifics, but about what the general reality is. So I came into my senior years, my elder years, with this feeling of responsibility. I had to turn and face my audience. Normally, as a writer, the way that I'd always worked is I'd say, come along with me. Let's walk together into a certain circumstance and we'll look together at it and I'll tell you what I see. We'll be co-learners. I've been very disinclined to turn and face my readership, my audience, and speak, authoritatively and ex cathedra from that position, because I haven't wanted to do that. But so I reached my elder years, and it's like, now it's time for me to speak. It's time for me to turn and face you and tell you what it is I know. So I thought, well, what is it that I can talk about? I could talk about and have tried to talk about what I've learned from being with Native communities, but there's this other thing, and it came to light in a letter that I got from a woman named Jennifer, and she wrote me. And when you've got this sort of tiny celebrity that comes from having a public presence, people think you're more than you are, and sometimes they reach out to you with hopeful and sometimes even desperate aspirations and desires for communication. And this woman Jennifer wrote me and said, I want to be an artist, I want to be a writer, but no one understands me. Sometimes I think I should kill myself. I sit in my room, I don't know whether I have any talent. And it was just absolutely heartfelt. And it reminded me of a letter that I wrote when I was in graduate school. And it was a desperate letter to Norman Mailer when I was in graduate school at Stanford. And I was miserable. I didn't like Palo Alto in the Bay Area. I was a Minnesotan at heart. I was in a program of sort of hyper intellectualism, and the street life that I understood was gone from me. So I said, who is intelligent but not necessarily intellectual, whose writing I like? And it was Norman Mailer. So I wrote to Norman Mailer and wrote him this letter, this desperate letter saying, can I come and work with you? I mean, I blush when I think about it now. But he wrote back to me. And I actually put the letter in the book. If any of you want to pick up the book, which now is called The Artist's Journey, and essentially he said, usual boilerplate, but it was very personal. You can see that he's got, he wrote it on a typewriter, he signed it by hand, and he said, you're going through a tough stretch. You probably feel differently already than you did when you wrote this, but know that there's nothing to be learned by sitting with someone like me. What you need to do is work more, write more, and don't give up on what it is you're trying to do. And so it was, I read this letter over and over and over. It was like a lifeline. And I held onto this like a drowning man holds onto a rope, And so when I got this letter from this Jennifer, I said, I should write back to her. I always try to write back to the people that write me. And I wrote this letter, started to write this letter back to her. I said, well, wait a minute. That's the elder book that I should write. I've got, over the years, I got friends who are, in symphony players. I know successful painters, Guggenheim photographers who have got things hung in MoMA, rock stars. I mean, and I've dealt with all these people. I've seen their creative process. I know what they go through. I know what I go through. And I thought, well, maybe this is what I should write. I should tell the story of what it is that a person goes through. I looked at these various books about creativity, and a lot of them are these rah books. You can do it. Find your inspiration, or what I think are extraneous and superficial exercises to try to find your creative self, or inspirational books. I said, that's not what I want to do. I want to tell you what the inside of the creative process is like. I want to write to you, those of you who are struggling as artists, those who have aspirations. It doesn't matter what the arts are. There are certain things that are common. And so I sat down and I put down on paper, the only book that really touched me in the way that I wanted to touch other people was Letters to a Young Poet, because he spoke of the creative process, and I can't touch Rilke, the hem of Rilke's cloak. I mean, he's who he is. But I could do something like that for my generation, for my people, for my time. And so that's what this book was. And that's sort of how I've ended up writing a book that's way out of the mainstream for for what people expect from me as an author. And it's a good book. I'm proud of it because I touched some really important themes. And so, I'll stop with that. But that's how we arrived sitting here looking at each other across the way. And I hope some of you will talk back too and talk about your struggles and your dreams and your aspirations within the creative process.
What would you say it means to be an artist?
Well, I make a distinction. I made it early on because there's a whole lot of people who, and I want to find just a little passage again. My apologies. This is not me wishing to shill. It's me because I think I say it best sometimes in my writing. I think being an artist, there's a fundamental difference between art and artistry, and that's. Give me 30 more seconds, see if I find it. And if I don't, we'll just talk it. But there's a difference between art and artistry. And art is, all right, let me read you a paragraph or two. There is art and there is artistry, and they are not the same. Artistry is raising an act to a level of proficiency and clarity that allows it to shine with a brilliance that others performing the same act seldom achieve. It is seeing through to the heart of an activity and performing it with mindfulness and excellence. The artistry of the surgeon, the artistry of the homemaker, the artistry of the mechanic and the machinist are all expressions of this urge towards excellence. Art is something different. It's creating something unique, never before seen or heard. A child freshly born adding a new voice to the chorus of creation. It is fragile. It moves on unsteady legs, uncertain of its place, or even if it has a place at all. It differs from artistry in that artistry is an elevation, a consecration of the ordinary, whereas art is the creation of something from nothing. So I wanted, I think it's very important to say that there is artistry in almost every task. It's finding it, it's more of a Eastern concept that raising something to the point of clarity and purification, and that can be in any field. It can be, I tend to think that teaching is the highest calling there is, and a good teacher is someone who knows when to touch, when to criticize, when to elevate, when to tamp them down, how they combine the human with the intellectual. And a great teacher is an absolute artist, but theirs is an art of artistry, not an art of creating from nothing. On the other hand, there are those who paint, there are those who compose, there are those who write, and they're creating from nothing. They're putting something new into the world. But artists, there's artistry in all of us. There's the capacity to be an artist in our lives is very important for all of us to live the best life we can. And I try to make a point that there are people who want to be art makers of art, but they're not suited to it. And there's no fault. You needn't have any apology for saying, no, this is not what I can do. What I need to do is find the artistry in nursing, find the artistry in farming, knowing how to look at a field, knowing how to read the weather, knowing how to fix things that nobody else could even figure out how to fix, do it on a fly, knowing about timing, knowing how everything works, and doing it the best way. You know those people, you look at them and say, that son of a gun's an artist. And it's an artist of the ordinary. So I see that as the distinction that needs to be made, and I try to make it, but I want to celebrate everyone's possibility of being, of artistry in their own lives.
Well, that kind of speaks to the observation that in many cultures, there is no artist profession, so to speak. The artist is not singled out. Everybody who does something, as you were talking about in artistry, they add something that we would call art to it, but there's no person who just does art.
Right.
You know, in many cultures, that's the case. Like if you make pots, you're going to put your own design on it, and you're going to find a way to decorate. If you do clothing, whatever you do, if you make a hammer, you carve something on the handle or you shape it in a certain way, and that's your, and as a result, you see art everywhere, but you never see an artist gallery.
Yeah. And you could go even further and say that the art of, like I made mention, the art of the homemaker, the person.
Yes.
There's of course the tea ceremony in Japan, but if you go just to the ordinary putting forth a meal for 20 people and doing it gracefully, knowing how to give people an experience of joy and clarity in their life without being intrusive. I mean, that's an art form too. I watch my wife, who's just happens to love to cook and is a wonderful an artist of the kitchen, an artist of the table. And I really think we need to find the artistry in our lives. We need to celebrate the artistry we see in the ordinary people. So I really
it's interesting that you should mention the artistry in the home, is because for many people that is their gallery. I mean, and for some people, for example, their yard is their gallery. They go around with measuring all the blades of grass and with their little scissors and making sure they're all the grass is level, and if they see one that's unleveled, their heart stops and they go out and clip it.
Right. And if you go into a town, you can sort of go through a town and so you can see it's what is important to it and what people do elevate and what people raise up. And so and if you sort of learn to see the world that way, then of course it becomes even a richer experience for you. And that's when a person who is a writer or a painter or something is starting to see what is unique and where the artistry is in any community, and they turn around and give it back to us, which is what the creative artist as the creator of an object does, is they look at the world that the rest of us see and give it back to us in a new way that makes us say, oh yeah, I didn't see it that way. And sometimes it stretches us. Sometimes we can't realize what it is they're trying to say. And sometimes, I'm sorry to say, it's just bogus that there's people who are self-referential, and they're really not out there to give you something back so much as they're out there to celebrate their own esoteric vision. And that's something else I want people to know, is that just because you don't understand something doesn't mean you're deficient. It might mean that the person didn't do a very good job. I know this little side anecdote. When I go out to read, or when I'm reading out loud, or when I'm reading a book to myself, let's use the reading out loud example. I'll go out and give a public presentation and I'm reading from some of my works and I feel myself losing my audience. And there's a thing when you're speaking in public. It's a great experience to know that, to have that feeling of that energy that goes back and forth. And when that energy is withdrawn, it's like, oh, geez, what's going on? Well, very often, if you're sitting in the audience and you're sort of fading out, you think, well, I'm the one that's deficient. I'm not understanding what's going on. Oh no, very often what's going on is that I, as the creator, as the speaker, am not present to it or have hit a real flat spot on what I've done. And that's communicated to you. So it's in not, the audience gives you power, but the audience also is a reflection. And like in a creative process, you can sometimes hit those points where you do something that's meaningless or it isn't very good. And to turn around and say to the people, well, the reason you don't get it is because you just aren't, level of understanding isn't sufficient to the brilliance of what I've done. No, that's not necessarily.
You mean that's not the case?
Not necessarily. It can be, but most people I know who speak of the brilliance of what they do are not creating anything very brilliant.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the interesting experiences I've had recently is I had a mission to kind of interview people from various walks of life on how they thought the Arts Council could better serve them.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the themes that came up often was that people felt disconnected from the arts and they didn't think of themselves as artists because they weren't doing things that ended up in the Guggenheim,
Yeah.
And they even rejected the idea of calling themselves an artist. They prefer, but if you say, well, that's, an artist is someone who's creative, well, okay, I can say I'm creative, when I can take, some pieces of loose metal and decorate a saddle,
Mm-hmm.
and put pictures on a leather saddle, then yeah, I could see that's creative. Or you will have people who will just for the fun of it put lipstick on a cow,
Mm-hmm.
and enjoy that as a creative experience just to see what the cow looks like, So I would say, well, yeah, you're an artist now. Let's see if we can put that in a gallery, but or not, But it gets. I wonder if you could comment on that. Have you seen that? Have you?
Oh, absolutely. Well, we have a way of knowing or get a ratification of someone as an artist. Well, I'm a writer. Why? Because I have books. Well, if none of my work ever got published, am I any less a writer? Well,
Right.
I'm in some ways, yes, but in many ways, no. It just means that I haven't had my identity reified around that notion of writing by the fact that a book is out there. Are you less an artist because your work isn't in a gallery, even though you're painting and you're giving it to your friends? Or your little kids don't have this problem. They're out there, they're painting. Look at this, look what I did. And it has an authenticity. And one of the things that they've done is they not let the critic get on their shoulder and start jabbering in their ear saying, not good enough, not good enough. And when I go into a town, I love little towns. Unfortunately, I'm stuck in a city right now or near a city, and it has its advantages. But when I go to the little towns, when I go driving around the Dakotas, for example, and I say the Dakotas because I'm thinking of specific times in North Dakota, I don't go into, sorry, whoever's out there listening, I don't go into the little galleries. I go into the farmer museums and the things where where people have done these crazy things and clarified their own world and these just beautiful little creations, and sometimes they're absolutely insane, but they focused on them in a way that has allowed them to make something beautiful out of them. In fact, my I started as a sculptor, and I spent 20 years as a sculptor before I switched to writing. And what started me on sculpture was I was in Germany, uh, had been sent there. I was at Stanford, where I was just miserable when writing letters to Norman Mailer, and they they said I had to learn German. So I said, well, I don't want to sit in a classroom all summer in Palo Alto. I can't do it. Besides, I've never been much with language labs. And they said, well, all right, go to Germany. Well, I don't have any money. What am I supposed to do? So they gave me $1,000 and sent me. And I hitchhiked into Germany. I'm in Germany. They gave me a town to go to. I went to this little town of Marburg, and went in and said I wanted to work. I I found a woman who said I could work in her son's antique restoration shop. And I figured, well, you do something with your hands. When you're doing something in common with someone else, you have to put words to what you're doing, to the actions and to the objects. So anyway, I went to work for him, and what I started doing was wandering the streets at night. I was miserable, but learning that sometimes the two go hand in hand. And I started going into these little museums. And I was studying religious art at the time. And I was steeped in Donatello and Michelangelo and Rodin, who were my great heroes. But the ones that knocked me out were these farmer museums, these Bauernkunst that for these crucifixes and Madonnas that they carved, and they didn't have any technical skill whatsoever. They had enough to render. But what they did is, because everything that they did was life and death decisions that they made. They just said, what do I do to get this shape out? How do I make an eye? How do I do that? And they would make these figures that just pulsed and yearned with their own spiritual clarity and aspiration. And that's what I see when I go into these small museums. It turned me into a sculptor. I said, I said, I'm not going back. I'm going to sit and, analyze, theories of soteriology or whatever we were studying at the time in Stanford in the graduate program. I'm going to try to find where the heartbeat of people is. And that heartbeat is in their creations. It's in the paintings they do. It's in the way they decorate their house. It's in the way that guy's out there with his scissors on his lawn and complaining about his neighbor who lets the weeds grow. And that finding that artistry has always been a joy. And you go to these little museums, and you can't believe the things that someone has done that no one even knows about. And to me, they're a whole lot more important than the guy, spray painting walls in New York City and getting, $1 million for it, because this guy is just figuring out how to use his baling wire and his tools to create a machine that works, has done something that to me is much more instrumentally important, and in a way is more spiritually important. But that's just a personal bias on this, but I let it out anyway.
Yeah. Tell us how you really feel.
That's right.
Well, I'm going to open it up right now to our other participants in this conversation. Any of you have questions or comments, experiences that you've had vis-a-vis bringing art out in your life or expressing some creative drive that you have? And I know we have at least a few artists on this Zoom conference here. So anybody? Everybody? Well, Betty?
Yes, good morning. You know, I could only stay quiet for so long with Mr. Nerburn in the room. I've had the joy and privilege of being with him in 3 or 4 different locations when he was reading and
I thought
talking.
that was a familiar face. The only
Yeah,
face I see other than, the rest of you are all hidden, but go ahead.
thank you. I guess the last time was right here in Aberdeen at the KOE Library. But and I have your book. I need to immerse myself in it. Maybe what I do mostly in the way of overt art is painting these days. And it's a privilege as an elder, which I'm well into my elderhood, to just be able to do what I want to do with my time and my energy. I don't really have a question. I guess I just wanted to talk to you and fill the space until some other brave soul would speak up. But it's been interesting. Maybe this will be a question before I get done. The last couple of years during the pandemic, surprised to find what a good hermit I can be. I never spent nearly that much time with only myself. I'm 77 years old, and this solitude is new to me. And it's almost hard to give it up. I'm kind of glad, and this is stupid, but I'm welcoming the coming winter because it means that again I will be isolated with myself and the things that I am now discovering in my life. I read some family history. I paint. I read a lot of other things. I keep on top of politics as much as I feel is healthy. One of the things I see happening myself, and not just with us old folks, but I think a lot of people have lost track of time. Time doesn't make sense to us anymore the way we have usually defined it. The clock, the calendar, what month is it? Has it only been has it already been a year? Has it, this kind of thing is just a jumble. Do you feel that? And how do you think it affects us as creative people?
Well, I'm shocked at how poorly, wrong choice of words, how different the bounce back is from where I was before this all started. And one of the elements of that, I mean, that's a subject unto itself, but one of the elements has been this odd relationship to time. One of the reasons that I create is because I can disappear from time inside of the creative moment. And I mean, I actually, because I actually wrote a couple of chapters on the influence of time in the in the creative process. And I mean, I'm going a little far afield here, but I think it's relevant. There is a factor of time in making something that people don't necessarily understand, and that is that anything created, a painting, there's the immediacy of the creative experience. Let's say if you're a musician, and musicians, I think, are about the happiest of the artists that I know because they have a moment. But if you're creating something that has duration, like a book or a painting, you change in the course of the time that this takes place. So the person that began that piece is not the person that ended it. And thus many times a person will end up saying, well, wait a minute, I have to go back and redo all of this. And then they can't decide if they go back and redo it. Sometimes they sand the edges off it and kill it. Other times it needs it, but you're dealing with this duration of time. And I think that the pandemic has allowed us to move inside time in a different way. It becomes much more meditative. I mean, that the jangling edges of crazy, external experience haven't intruded quite as much. You can follow something out for a period of time that you couldn't before. And I think people created some good things as a result of this. And I mean, I know someone who, you mentioned family history. I have a couple of friends who have spent this time putting together a family history because that has to do with time, it has to do with duration, and it has to do with history, but they're able to focus on it, and they can deal with this verticality because what's going on a horizontal level isn't driving them quite as nuts as normal. But one last thing, just because it came up, I've been thinking about this a lot. There's another aspect of time in creating something that I write about because I think it's important for people who make things to know this, that I still face it, and I'm facing it really heavily right now. And that is, sometimes you're done and the work isn't done. And other times the work is done and you're not done. And right now, I decided what I was going to do to save my brain and maybe my soul during the course of the pandemic, was I was going to write a novel. Okay, well, that's fine. And I thought I'd try some various things I'd never tried before. Well, I'm now down to the end of it, and I'm done, but the damn book isn't done. And and I mean, I remember this from sculpting. And then you say, okay, do I keep going? Where do I find the inspiration? Well, should I allow technique, that cunning knave, and yet that wonderful skill to drive me forth to the end? Or should I wait until I can go inside the event again and move it to the end? Will I work it too hard? Will I work it too much? Will I kill the life in it? Am I a charlatan? Am I faking it at this point? But I got to get this damn thing done. And this sense of time as sometimes being, it's not always your friend. It can be your friend. It can focus you, but it also, duration, your duration may not be the same duration as the work of art you're creating. And that never changes for anyone, I think, making things. So, that's all over that's wandering all over the landscape on this notion of time. But I really do think, like you said, that time is, this pandemic has been good for the focus and kind of the annihilation of time. But I don't know how we come out of it at the end. It's like, hey, I'd like to come to the surface now, but no, I'm still in a screen. I'm still in a room. I still don't want to be with 50 people at a time. It's odd. Anyway, okay. So that's half an answer, or an answer and a half. I don't know.
It's many answers, very much
Many
appreciated.
answers.
Thank
Blind
you.
man mowing the lawn,
I think we have a question or comment in the chat. It's hi Kent, I'd like to pass along this question from Trish, who is watching on Facebook. How can I encourage creativity and exploration and expressiveness with my angsty 12-year-old daughter who doesn't think that she likes art and says she's not creative/artistic? Personally, I feel all the kids are creative.
Well, what does she, then that's, I think, where you look to that elevation of what they do as art. One of the best places, to make them find the artistry inside what it is they do. I've often said to young people who can't write, I say, well, you write notes to your friends. Sadly, many of them now just text and use emojis, but that may be a way to create an art form in itself. But if they write, that Jennifer that wrote to me, essentially what she was a hurting young woman who journaled. She kept a diary. Whatever it is they do, what you want to do is to not hit the critical button with them. Find that place where they're making something. I don't care what it is, and support that, and then try to inject an awareness into them that what you're doing is decision making. You could have done this, you could have done that, but why did you do this? And try to make them find that experience of artistry inside what it is that they care about. And sure, you want to send them off to art classes, you want to send them to dancing classes, and they go and they come back and you say, how was it? It was boring, I don't want to go again. Well, you keep trying on that, and breathes there a parent out there that doesn't regret not making the kids stay with the piano lessons when they said they wanted to quit. But that's only one aspect. The other aspect of it is if you want to train the artist in them, don't necessarily try to train them into an art. Try to train them into an awareness.
Mm. I think that's a really important observation, Kent. I notice how effective that is when you see a kid doing anything. It doesn't have to be painting. Whatever they're trying is to engage them in, like, oh, that's interesting. Why do you, why did you throw the ball that way? You know,
Right.
or I noticed you tie your shoes in a different way than I've seen before. Um, what made you think of that? You know,
Yeah, absolutely.
And raise up whatever they're doing to have them discovered that they are, that not only are they creative, but that actually someone notices, you know.
Yeah.
And then that has a way of validating them. And I think that extends past just kids and how we interact with each other and boosting each other's creative juices, so to speak, is to comment on when somebody places something on the plate, to comment on the colors and to comment on the, you know, how the thing is placed on the plate or how the table is set. Or I've I've started to notice how people do their makeup, you know, because as you can probably see, aside from my overuse of mascara, I don't use makeup much. But I started to notice other people's, you know, like how they do their hair or their dress or their, you know, like their beard or something like that. And sometimes I will even say to someone who has, you know, they've gone through the trouble of doing their, you know, punk hairdo, and it's done. I'll say something like, I think I'm going to grow my hair out so I can have that hairstyle, you know, mostly just to say, I noticed you made an effort to be artistic on yourself, you know, or ask them about their tattoos or whatever. But I found that that's very effective in stimulating people to take a next step.
Sure. And every young person makes incredibly close decisions about the way they dress. I mean, they're hypersensitive as they're evolving their own personality and identity to the decisions they make. And very often we're available to be critical, but we're not available to point to ask them about what it was. And the other side of the coin is, who bothers to look at what the elderly are doing, the decisions they made. I mean, I remember years ago, before the awareness came to me, it was a shock. I was in a nursing home. This was before my mom was in nursing homes, before I spent much time with it. And there was, had to go through it. I used to wear I put on a Santa suit and go around and do things at Christmas. And sometimes I go to the nursing homes, and I went by the beauty shop. And here's this woman, well, she had to be in her 80s, getting her hair done. And at the time, it felt tragic to me. I said, oh my God, she's getting her hair done because she has nowhere to go. She's never going to leave this building. She's just going to die. And oh my God, what sort of world do we live in? And the older I got, the more I said, oh, no, that was her exercising her own artistry. But no one ever says it. No one brings it out. And, we're so sensitive to the critical on there. One of the things that most people in specifically in the arts, well, I guess in anything, is criticism kills, and criticism hurts more than praise helps usually. And but we don't do enough praise. We don't do enough thanking. We don't see the artistry in conversations, and we don't see, and like you say, asking people about what it is they do. It's not only about giving them trying to support them. Sometimes there's something to be learned. If you go into a room with a dentist, he's spotting everybody's teeth. You go into a room with a painter, and he or she is looking at all the colors that are made, and they see with a practiced eye. They hear with a practiced ear. A writer tends to hear language. I know because when I switched from sculpture to writing, my whole modality of perception changed. A sculptor saw in lights and shadows and shapes and forms. It wasn't a very relational art form, which is some of the reason why I changed to writing when I got involved with a family. A writer hears spaces in conversations, hears language patterns. And everybody, whatever it is they do, has a much more highly evolved understanding of something than you do. The kid has a more highly evolved understanding of why he or she, put this earring here rather than this earring here. And I don't take the time to find out about that usually, unless I bonk myself on the head and say, start paying attention, start paying attention. It has to do with a mindful application of attention and a certain application of kindness. And then the world opens up a little more.
Yeah, there's so much, as you point out, there's so much to the discovery, even of yourself, when you explore someone else. You're engaging, and you can't give without getting. It's just kind of like, you can't sit down on a stool and not exchange wood. You know what I mean? So whatever you do, whatever interaction you have, there's some exchange that happens.
Yeah, and one of the things I used to tell, it's especially true of teenagers, but one of the things I'd say for making them try to bring the artistry in them out is I'd take them out and sit them in this one particular instance. I remember the situation, sit them on the edge of a lake. We were in northern Minnesota, and I said, "You guys sit here. Sit here for an hour." And, well, what are we supposed to do? Nothing. Start taking it in, take it in, and let the words fall away, let the apprehension start to take place, and find out what it is that's out there, and see what that's really the nature of the real creative experience, is to find out what's out there, to take it in, and to translate it into something else. Because if you're only pulling it outside of pulling it from inside your own self, then that's limited. You need to be fed. The world needs to feed you, and the way the world needs to feed you is you have to have all your senses open to it. And sometimes all you can do is, like we were saying, like the one woman was saying about her daughter, or I think it was her daughter, that make them open to their senses. What are the choices? Watch how the day. At what point in the day do you become antsy and wait for it to be over? And when do you notice the sun changing? When do you notice yourself being bored? When just watch yourself. Watch yourself, not to criticize yourself, but just to sort of see who you are and see what the world is. And look, at once you learn how to see it in yourself, you learn to see it in others, and you can ask the intelligent questions.
Mm-hmm. I find, just on that same subject, inclusion is very powerful too. If you're doing something, having them be included or giving them something to do, and especially if it's a small thing, as opposed to like, help me to create this, be a part of this big project. I noticed when I was putting together the Vinegar Museum, and these small boys would come in to see what I was doing, and they were intrigued by the building, and they almost would fight over a hammer. It's like, well, who could just hand me the hammer? They wanted to be involved. And you give them something to do, and then you point out that, well, you did a pretty good job of that without me ever saying anything about how to do it. You somehow knew how to do it. But the idea is that it's their way. And I was lucky to have a father who did that to me. When I wanted to go to work with him, he handed me and I was about 4 or 5 years old, and he handed me a handful of bench nails and say, I really need these straightened out.
Right.
You know what I mean? And I was right on top of that. And he just said, boy, that was better than it came out of the box. You did a good job. And then after that, it's like, so it just becomes part of like how I interact with the world. But I found in retrospect that that's useful. It's useful for me to learn, like I learned so much from getting fresh eyes from people who don't even think of themselves as doing art or something like that. They just are trying to live their lives, but I get a lot of insight from that interaction.
Well, do we have anybody else out there who's ready to speak up?
Yeah.
Hey, voices. Hey, people.
We have a comment from Jason in the chat. Kent, I was just wondering if you had any reaction to that. She says, appreciate the positive thoughts, affirming one another and encouraging the creativity and all. There is no word for art in the Lakota language. Art is in everything and everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just, that's not quite a question, just sort of asking for a response. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't quite know what to say in that regard. That there is, in my experience with the Native people, is that they very seldom bring it out in terms of an external object that has no utilitarian value. There's the artistry of lifestyle, which you go back to using nature, using the animals, using the standard thing about using all the parts of the buffalo. There's artistry in those choices, but there's also artistry in decoration. And it's not artistry divorced from content. One of the great things about working with spiritual content, the working with the Native people, has been that art has power. The creation of things have power. You don't do it as it's not frivolous and it's not purely aesthetic. The Ojibwe that I worked with, in their floral designs on their moccasins, they would make very specific choices of why they put certain flowers in certain configurations and what it meant for that particular person. And I think the Nez Perce, I remember one of the most poignant moments I had when I was doing this book on Chief Joseph, and I was talking to a Nez Perce man, and he was showing me their cradle boards, and he was talking about the distinction of the people that put them on bead by bead, and the people that would put do the decoration by having a string of beads and then put that string on. And he said, well, you notice that it's the blue background. And I said, well, yeah, it's beautiful. And he said, no, it's not just beautiful. It's the color of forever. And the color of forever we put on there for the child to have a long life. And so this isn't just an aesthetic decision. It's got a spiritual dimension to it as well. And I sort of bifurcate when I look at this stuff, because I can go down a sociological route and say, well, the Nez Perce had a lot of free time because they were in a very rich environment, that they moved vertically through the landscape, and they had food available to them in the same place at all times, and they were able to create. They had time to create. That old argument you hear about why great art came out of the Renaissance is because there was leisure time for people. But that's only looking at the artistic side. The other side, and the Nez Perce were incredibly creative. I mean, and their decoration, all the other tribes wanted what they did because they were so nuanced and worked so hard and created such beautiful saddlery and war clubs, and everything they did, they embellished with beauty. But the beauty was always for a purpose. And I see, I didn't do a lot of work with the Lakota in terms of their creative output. I mean, I know some of the decorations, I know those the people that struggled to do like the ledger books was an actual outpouring of creativity, but more than that, you'd find it in things like the winter count, uh, paintings that were done. Those are all choices that were made. But I don't think there's this feeling of, at least prior to maybe the 20th century, this feeling of creating art for art's sake. It's creating art for symbolic presence, for calling forth a power. And that in many ways, I think, is really a greater form of art. And I don't just mean that for the native people. When art was power, when art was the calling down of power, I think we lived in a better world than when art is merely, when it's divorced from this relationship to spiritual power and instead becomes merely an aesthetic experience. But we live in a world where both of those dimensions are there. I'm just afraid that many of us now deal only with the aesthetic. We don't deal with the sort of accumulation and coalescence of power, which is what art traditionally was. So.
Well, Jace also did have a question at the end of that. She asked, what do you do to encourage positivity in our world? And I think you were sort of pointing in that direction with your last comments.
Well, no one ever accused me of being overly positive. Part of the reason I create art is because I need to call forth my best self. The critical self, the dark self, the Jeremiah, that's sort of came with my temperament. It came with my temperament. It came with my upbringing. It came in the things I saw as a child. Darkness is home for me, and the critical self. One of the problems of going through a lot of academic world is you're taught to be critical. Art for me it's a language and it's a religion in a way. It's a religion of positivity. You can't create out of negativity. You have to create. You're making choices. The choices you make are affirmative choices. Yes, I'll do this. Yes, I'll do this. Yes, I'll do this. And maybe you're spending a lot of time thinking about the no's that you don't do, but ultimately anything you create is a yes. And so for me, that's what when I talk about the art, why I wanted to do this book was because it is about the yes. I mean, you were talking about, I think it was Betty was talking about, creating her paintings. That's where the health and the healing is you're making a yes decision. The kid choosing the clothes is making a yes decision. And yes is affirmation, no is negation. And so to me, that's how I try to encourage positivity is I try to find the yes in what people are doing. And instead of, I'll try in a conversation to not confront the other person with what they say, but to try to build on what they say. What is it? Yes, yes, yes. Let's go further. Let's go further. And that's a type of artistry. Beneath it is sort of a dark, brooding troll of a soul. But hey, you work with what you got.
Got to be a place for those people too.
That's right.
It's a big world.
My last little thing on that is I used to say about some of my books. It was like I was under the bridge. I did a book on the prayer of St. Francis at one point because it was just a good meditation for me, and someone wanted me to do it. And I said, I felt like the troll under the bridge holding an angel up on a stick with that book. And so the people go over the bridge and they looked at us and, what's that troll doing down there? I said, no, look at the angel on the stick. And that's sort of what I look at as an artist. It's a troll under the bridge, but I try to get that angel up there so people see the good stuff.
Yeah, there you go. Well, we have come to the end of our road, or the end of our time for this segment. I want to thank you very much, Ken, for a very enlightening and stimulating conversation. I think the things that you have shared with us could be of quite a big use if we sort of used it. So I'm hoping that we'll are you going to be part of the big celebration in the book festival? Are you going to be doing stuff
I
there?
am. I'll be there on Saturday, and they have, I think it's 1 o'clock. I'll have to look, but they have told me that I'm happy about it, that they want me to talk about this book, The Artist's Journey, and I want to. This is a quiet child.
Yeah.
Hasn't spoken much in public, but I think it's consolation for those people, consolation and inspiration. And I really care about the creator in all of us, because the creator in me has sort of what's saved me in my life. So if you're at all interested, I'll talk a little more deeply about the book and about some of the innards of the creative process. And so, yes, I'll be there on Saturday. I'm so sad that the book festival isn't in person. I'm sure they're not as sad as they are back in Brookings.
Yeah.
But we work with what we got, and maybe
Exactly.
maybe that's the ultimate statement of creativity: is how you work with what you got and turn it positive.
Exactly. Well, I want to thank everybody for being here, and we will see you next week, same time, same station.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for having me. I miss your state.
Thank you.